Have you ever wondered how a country like the United States today, known for its vast power, global influence, and rich cultural diversity, actually came into existence? The story of how the USA came into being is not just about war or politics. It's about people, principles, conflict, compromise, and ultimately transformation. It's the tale of how 13 distant colonies scattered along the Atlantic coast of North America challenged the world's greatest empire and gave birth to an entirely new kind of nation, one based on the radical idea that people could govern themselves. This is a story shaped by visionaries, rebels, philosophers, and everyday individuals who dared to imagine something different. The origins of the United States can be traced back to the early 1600s. At that time, Europe was gripped by exploration. The British, French, Spanish, Dutch, and others were sending explorers and settlers across the Atlantic Ocean in search of land, riches, and opportunity. In 1607, the British established their first successful permanent colony in North America at Jamestown, Virginia. Over the next century and a half, more colonies would be established, each for different reasons. Some were created for economic opportunities. Others, like Massachusetts, were settled by Puritans seeking religious freedom. By the 1700s, 13 British colonies had formed along the eastern coast of North America. These included New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Life in the colonies was challenging, but over time the settlers built towns, farms, roads, schools, and governments. Although they were governed by the British Crown, the colonies developed a sense of independence. They had their own elected assemblies, their own militias, and their own local laws. The colonists began to see themselves not just as British subjects but as Americans. As the colonies grew more prosperous, tensions with the British government increased. In 1763, Britain emerged victorious from the French and Indian War, a conflict that had cost the empire vast amounts of money. To pay off its war debts and maintain a standing army in America, Britain began to tax the colonies more aggressively. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring colonists to buy special paper for printed materials. This was followed by the Townshend Acts in 1767, which taxed goods like glass, paint, and tea. These taxes were met with fierce resistance. Colonists argued that they were being taxed without representation, that they had no elected voice in the British Parliament, and therefore should not be subject to these taxes. Protests erupted across the colonies. Merchants boycotted British goods. Pamphlets and newspapers criticized the British government. One of the most famous incidents occurred in Boston in 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd of angry colonists, killing 5 men. This became known as the Boston Massacre, and only fueled anti-British sentiment. In 1773, the situation escalated when colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped an entire shipment of British tea into the water. This act of defiance became known as the Boston Tea Party. In response, the British government passed the coercive acts called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, which closed Boston Harbor and placed Massachusetts under military rule. The colonies began to unite in opposition. In 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They called for a boycott of British goods and began preparing for the possibility of war. Tensions reached a breaking point in April 1775. British troops were sent to Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts to seize weapons and arrest rebel leaders. They were met by colonial militias, and the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of an 8-year struggle for independence. Soon after, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. They appointed George Washington as commander of the newly formed Continental Army. Over the following months, the colonies moved closer to full independence. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. The document proclaimed that all men are created equal, that they have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. It was a revolutionary statement, not just politically, but philosophically. For the first time, a group of colonies declared that they would no longer be ruled by a distant king, they would govern themselves. The Revolutionary War was long and brutal. At times it looked like the colonies might fail. Washington's army faced defeat after defeat. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers suffered through bitter winters, especially at Valley Forge, yet the colonists fought on, driven by a belief in their cause. In 1777, American forces achieved a crucial victory at the Battle of Saratoga, convincing France to enter the war on the American side. French support, including troops, weapons, and a powerful navy, helped tip the balance. In 1781, American and French forces trapped British General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. With no escape, Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending the war. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. But while the war had been won, many challenges remained. The country needed a government that could unite the states and provide stability. At first, the United States was governed by the Articles of Confederation, a loose agreement between the states that created a weak central government. The national government had no power to tax, no authority to regulate trade, and no president to enforce laws. It quickly became clear that this system wasn't working. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The result was a bold document that created a stronger federal government, while still protecting the rights of individual states. The Constitution established 3 branches of government: the executive branch, led by a president; the legislative branch, made up of a Senate and House of Representatives; and the judicial branch, which included the Supreme Court. It also included a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. After months of debate and compromise, the Constitution was signed in September 1787 and ratified by the states in the following year. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. In 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights, were added, guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, the press, and other essential liberties. The United States was now a functioning republic, based on democratic ideals and the rule of law. It was a new experiment in self-government, unlike anything the world had seen before. But the challenges were far from over. The young nation would go on to face internal divisions, wars, expansion, civil rights struggles, and growing pains. It would expand westward, fight a civil war, welcome millions of immigrants, and evolve into a multicultural democracy. But the foundation laid in those early years remains. The belief that government should serve the people, not the other way around. The conviction that freedom and equality are not just dreams, but rights worth fighting for. The United States of America did not come into being overnight. It was the result of centuries of ideas, decades of conflict, and years of sacrifice. From colonial settlements to global leadership, from revolution to constitution, the story of how the USA came into being is one of the most important chapters in world history. It teaches us that nations are not just built by laws or leaders, but by people who are willing to stand up for what they believe, work together for a common cause, and build a future from the ground up. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who love learning about the past. Drop a comment below and tell us what topic you'd like to see next. Until then, keep exploring, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.